Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, May 6th, 2020, and today we're going to be talking about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the 2020 presidential election. So the last time I made a video about this, it was on March 21st, 2020, when Donald Trump had an overall net approval of 0.5% on his handling of the coronavirus, with a 48% approval rating compared to a 47% disapproval rating. That led into Donald Trump being approved of for a pretty consistent period of time, peaking at 6% net approval nationwide, and since has dropped to an overall net negative of 9.1%. Obviously, Donald Trump's personal handling of the coronavirus is viewed a lot more negatively than it previously was when I made my former video. And as considering the fact that this pandemic is still going on over a month later, I decided to make another video about it. So I think that it's going to be the most important issue heading into the 2020 election. If the COVID-19 pandemic had happened any earlier, I could pretty much be solid in my statement that Bernie Sanders would still be in the race for the presidency as of right now. The entire issue of healthcare has become a very big issue on the national stage, and Donald Trump has been dipping further and further down in terms of his net approval in both the job approval rating and in terms of handling the coronavirus. So when you take a look, obviously Donald Trump was at a negative point in early March, but at the time of my previous video, even when Donald Trump had a net approval rating of 0.5%, I gave the victory to the Democrats with 279 electoral votes. I will not be as lenient towards Donald Trump this time around, considering the fact that the majority of Americans do not approve of him, number one, and in terms of handling the coronavirus, it's even worse than his job approval rating, which I honestly did not think was going to happen. When Donald Trump had rapidly changed his tune on the coronavirus, that is when America started to listen to him, and at least Democrats and independents alike and Republicans, all of them started to take Donald Trump a lot more seriously. But since then, it looks like his approval rating has taken a huge hit to an overall negative net 9.1% with the disapprove. So a 44% approval rating from what used to be a 48% approval rating. That 4% difference may not seem like a lot, but the the disapproval rating difference is definitely way more important than what his personal approval rating is. Those who are angry with the president are more likely to vote than those who are just complacent with the way that President Trump is handling this situation. So those polls are taken as an overall average. They're from Real Clear Politics. If you don't agree with them, that's not necessarily for me to prove. I'm not here to defend the legitimacy of polls 100% of the time, but they're almost always accurate, and they are the data that I will be using. I'm not going based off my gut. I go off actual data and no real personal bias against certain polls, other than some that are, I guess, historically inaccurate. For example, I would say possibly the LA Times polls, which I haven't seen any for 2020, or Emerson, which is pretty accurate on some races, not so much in primaries and in the general election, but they are in other statewide races. But again, it just all depends on the polling firm. But generally, I do take the average because it does take all of the sources, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC alike, and averages them out, which is honestly probably one of the best ways to look at this. 538 does have their own rating, so if you want to actually see which pollsters are considered A or B grade, you can go over to 538.com and go ahead and find that on there. But for right now, I use Real Clear Politics for the overall average. When you look at this electoral map, Joe Biden starts off with a solid 183 electoral votes compared to Donald Trump at 125. This is pretty much how we start off every single election prediction. Obviously, I am going to narrow down some of these states just because with increased African American turnout, some of these states are 100% going to be narrower than they were in 2016. Mississippi and South Carolina, yes, they're solid Republican states, but if you disagree with me on the point that they should be likely, go back to when Obama was in office and he won the presidential election in both 2008 and 2012. Look at Mississippi and look at South Carolina, and the margins speak for themselves. Yes, they were larger than what they would be now if Obama was the nominee, but Biden is a lot more resonant with African American voters and white voters, pretty much every voter, than Hillary Clinton was in 2016, which is exactly why his approval rating amongst Americans is way higher than what Secretary Clinton's was back in 2016. So President Trump has a lot of work to do. If he's able to win this election, this cannot be looming over the presidential election. 34% of voters, according to the most recent Monmouth University poll, say they are not likely at all to vote by mail in the presidential election, which means that these ballots need to be up and running and ready for in-person voting as soon as November. Now, that may seem like a long time from now. It's May. But then again, we were talking about this in April. We were talking about this in mid-March when pretty much the entire nation got shut down. And realistically, if people don't actually take precautions that they need to, this will be a looming over the 2020 election, the entirety of this general election campaign season. It seems like the Democratic primary was the only time where the coronavirus wasn't the main issue on this general election stage. But if you look at some of the states that Joe Biden, I honestly said at the time, I used the Democratic nominee because it was still between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. But at that point in time, it was a 99% chance Joe Biden was going to be the nominee. Joe Biden had a pretty good shot at a number of states, regardless of Donald Trump being necessarily approved of in terms of his handling of the coronavirus situation. As this progresses, yes, the 2020 electoral map may look different, at least my prediction may look different than what this map is, but this is if the coronavirus pandemic continues, and it continues at this rate where Donald Trump is no longer being approved of. I had him losing the election when he was approved of by the coronavirus situation because a small 0.5% net approval does not negate the overall job approval rating, nor does it negate all of the Democratic momentum that's entering into the 2020 race on Joe Biden's side. And if you look at a lot of the special elections and midterm elections, and I'm not going to make the mistake that Republicans made for the 2012 election, or I'm going to try not to, but realistically, Democrats were winning in areas that Republicans previously were dominant in. Whether that was in Alabama, whether that was in Arizona, whether that was coming close in Texas and Georgia, it was a lot of things that got a lot closer than what they previously should have been. And if you take a look at the 2010 midterm elections, yes, it was pretty solid, but we saw nowhere near that turnout in 2010. The turnout on the Democratic side and the Republican side was super high in 2018. It rivaled the 2004 presidential election. In fact, it rivaled the 2012 presidential election when Barack Obama was on the ballot. A lot of people voted in those midterm elections, whereas in 2014, there was 33% turnout compared to 50% in 2018. So there was a lot more momentum on the Democratic side than what we saw in previous midterm elections for the Republicans. Obviously, things change, but if you take a look at the overall landscape, it's going to be a lot more beneficial for the Democrats as we enter into this map, into this general election. So let's go ahead and characterize some of the remaining states. Obviously, some of these states are going to remain in favor of Donald Trump, but I'm going to talk about some of these states that I considered likely last time that I will not hesitate in considering likely again for Joe Biden. That includes Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. Minnesota is pretty solidly going to be a Democratic state. As for Michigan and Pennsylvania, these are two states that flipped for Donald Trump in 2016, but I very much expect them to go back to the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. First of all, Joe Biden was born in Pennsylvania. He was crucial to Barack Obama's victory there. Barack Obama won Pennsylvania both times, in the state of Michigan as well, and he was crucial to the auto bailout, which was one of the main issues that helped Hillary Clinton get as many votes as possible in the state of Michigan. Now, I understand she lost the race, but it would not nearly have been as close, considering that Donald Trump had never before seen campaign tactics that revolutionized the way that we look at the modern campaign team. And when you look at Donald Trump's campaign, it was very different. It was not normal, and it was something that was winnable. It was not with the status quo. It was something that Republicans didn't think would work, Democrats didn't think would work, and it ended up working. And it works in tinier elections when Donald Trump campaigns for certain House races or Senate elections or endorses certain primary competitors against incumbents, and those primary competitors end up winning. It's really interesting. We have an interesting case about that down in Alabama for the Senate race coming up. But honestly, even if the entire situation does end up negative for Donald Trump, which it looks like it's on track to do, and this does end up impacting the 2020 election as big of a impact as at least of what I think is going to be right now, Texas will still be close. Inevitably, it's going to be close. Whether it's going to be a lean or likely margin is all dependent on Republican turnout, but Texas is still going to be close, but there's no way that Joe Biden takes away the state of Texas. As for Wisconsin, I'm still going to characterize that one as a lean Democratic state, but for Arizona, I'm going to be characterizing that one as well as a lean Democratic state. Now, before I would only consider Wisconsin a lean Democratic state. Now I'm going to carry the state of Arizona over into the Democratic column. I actually think Arizona will vote to the left of Wisconsin in the 2020 election. As for Donald Trump's hold in a number of southern states, I'm going to go ahead and say that he does narrowly hold on to the state of Georgia. And for right now, I'm going to keep the state of Florida as a complete toss-up. I will do the same for the states of Iowa and Ohio. These are 3 states, though pretty well voted for Trump in 2016 for Iowa and Ohio, and Florida showing consistent Republican elections in statewide elections, special elections, midterm elections, 2016 election. If you look at that state, all 3 of these states, realistically, they should be going for Trump in 2020. Unfortunately for Donald Trump, if his approval rating is getting and continues to get worse than it is right now, at a negative net 9.1% nationwide in terms of handling the coronavirus, this issue will be present in every single voter's mind as they enter into the ballot or send in their mail-in ballot and figure out who they're voting for ahead of time. But for the state of Nebraska, I will say that Donald Trump has a narrow victory there in this situation. Again, Joe Biden resonates with white voters a lot better than Hillary Clinton did, and also with pretty much every single type of voter. As for the Maine 2nd District, I will still characterize that one as a lean Democratic district. But for right now, this is the big one. The state of North Carolina, I'm going to narrowly give to Joe Biden. Now, the reasoning for that, number one, Republicans are completely neglecting the state of North Carolina. This is a state that has a very dominant Republican presence in the House of Representatives, even though it really shouldn't be based off of the overall population, but also they have 2 Republican senators who one actually might be ousted in this 2020 Senate election, but overall, North Carolina has a Republican identity. The last time it went to a Democrat was in 2008 for Barack Obama, in which the state of Indiana had a higher percentage for Obama than North Carolina. I mean, that's practically insane that Indiana, which is now solidly red, and now North Carolina, which I consider to be tilt blue, voted similar in 2008, but Indiana more so to the left. And if you just take a look at the state of North Carolina itself, it just has a Republican history. It realistically should be going for Donald Trump. If he was handling this situation better, which he was when I made that video back in March, I had him winning the state of North Carolina. I had him winning the state of Florida. I had Joe Biden still winning the election narrowly because it was not at Donald Trump's peak in terms of the way that he was handling the coronavirus and the way that America viewed it. But when you take a look at the data, it was an overall net approval rating of 0.5%. And if you take a look now, it's an overall net negative of 9.1%. Obviously, the landscape has changed, and North Carolina definitely is going to be a little bit more Democratic than the state of Florida, at least for 2020. With increased African-American turnout, it's definitely going to help more in North Carolina than it would in the state of Florida. But this pretty much wraps up my map. It puts Donald Trump at 180 electoral votes, a negative down of 44 electoral votes from what I used to characterize it at 224. I will do coronavirus type updates for the 2020 electoral map as we progress through the election season, because this issue I can almost guarantee will be still talked about October, November, up until Election Day, possibly even past that. But Joe Biden is now at 305 electoral votes, breaking almost near what Donald Trump got in 2016. So that leaves 3 toss-up states, Iowa, Ohio, and Florida, and a total of 5 flipped states and 1 flipped congressional district from 2016. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all tomorrow.